going to say I've never read the book this slowly and digested it this much, because I'm finding it a whole different flavor now that I kind of understand the concepts. This time around that I can read it, I can savor it. It's like a different experience. I'm not struggling with the cognitive understandings. It's like more, this is amazing truth.
Yeah.
It's lovely. Thank you for convening us.
Yeah, this has been great. I feel that too. Every time I go back and revisit something, I have an element of that, which is both beautiful and actually for me sort of infuriating too, because there is a sense, that I used to have of like, oh, I'll just read all the things. And then, but then I hadn't considered that reading it at 23 versus 32 or whatever, that like it's a different reading each time. So there's no, you can never really get on top of it because you change
I'm
every.
like saying this might be the last time I ever read it. So
well,
like, this is like succulent for me.
That's good.
That's
good. Well, let's hop into it. Let us. I want to come up with the right metaphor to build off the succulent thing without it sounding weird, but let's take a bite of the juiciness of this text. I don't know, that didn't work. Oh well.
Yeah, I get it.
Also, again, wanted to thank Brandon Norgard for really organizing, really doing the whole logistical part of this now, which I greatly appreciate. And with the more advanced form of Zoom that he has, is able to avoid us, allow us to avoid the inconvenience of jumping off at 40 minutes, etc. So thanks for that. Appreciate it. Okay, well, let's just dive on in. For me, there are a couple of places that really speak to me. So
first of all, just to clarify, we're doing chapter 4. We're focusing on that, right?
Yes, chapter 4, A View from Within. And also, Brandon, you had a thing that you had wanted to do, a presentation. I don't know if you still want to do that. I know
it could be today. It could be whenever.
Okay.
I'm fine with today if you want to do it.
Sure, yeah.
It is related to not only this chapter, but the next chapters. So we'll see if we can fit it in.
Okay. Well, we can start there too if you want.
Yeah.
That'd be great. I'd love that.
Yeah, take it away.
I think that what I wanted to let Brendan finish his thoughts for a few minutes, and then I'll see if I can segue that into what I was going to talk about.
Oh, okay. Well, unfortunately, just as there's no end in the reading, there's no way to finish my thoughts. They keep going. But I'll just throw a few things out there, I guess. And then, yeah, if you want to pick it up. I guess one of the things, so this kind of came up before, but he says on page 117, the greater the depth of evolution, the greater the degree of consciousness. And this is one, I think, both an incredibly profound idea, but it's also one that I find that his framework adds some confusion to because of the infinitude of holons. And we talked about that at one point, and we don't have to focus on the problematized version. We could just jump into that, exploring that idea a little bit and swimming in it. The greater the depth of evolution, the greater the degree of consciousness. And so I don't know, that was one of those things that really jumped out to me. I mean, I think rather than there were a few things, as I said, that in this chapter I'd like to touch on, but I don't need to throw them all out right now. I figure we'll probably, as our conversation sort of unfolds, I'll be able to throw in the things that my points that were of special interest. So I don't really need to wrap up any thoughts. And you don't really need to have to segue or tie them together if you want to.
Well, that's actually that's good because this is an important, I think, frame for this whole thing, is about the evolution of holons and the degrees, the levels of complexity, how they relate to each other, this very generalized definition of evolution, where we can recognize Darwinian evolution as just one form of evolution. We can also recognize sociocultural evolution. And we can also recognize the, within this, he's drawing from a lot of different sources. And I believe it was Teilhard de Chardin who differentiated between the physiosphere, the biosphere, and the noosphere, right? So he's leveraging that tripartite distinction. And it's actually useful here to compare this to more recent scholarship because, Greg Henriquez and his collaborators, including John Vervaeke and others, they seem to think that there is like 4 planes of existence, not just 3. So there's a book that came out a few years ago called The 3 Big Bangs, and that aligns with this tripartite distinction, the first Big Bang being the physical, we usually think of as the Big Bang. And the second Big Bang was the emergence of life on Earth. And that's a qualitatively different distinction because of the degree of complexity that emerges out of this. So there's a degree of complexity that emerges from the Big Bang with all the matter. And then within that, eventually you get to the point where there's the conditions under which the biosphere emerges. And then the third Big Bang, supposedly, if we rank it according to that book, and also which is aligned with Teilhard de Chardin, is that the third one is the Big Bang of culture and all of the complexity of culture that we're living in now, which we agree, hopefully, that this does depend upon the biosphere. Like if the biosphere were to die, then we wouldn't have our culture here, would we? So now what's interesting is how we can maybe differentiate that. So I don't know if you guys are, or we could see that maybe there's a different way of framing that of the general evolution, and those and more than just those 3 Big Bangs. Maybe there's 4. Maybe we can, if you guys are familiar with Greg Henriquez's tree of knowledge system, then you could see how 3 of the 4 of those align with what he has there. But then there's another one, so let me just give me a moment here. I'll pull these documents up. Just a moment.
Can I ask a question to anybody who might have a thought about this? Is Wilber in this chapter laying out that consciousness is present throughout physiosphere, biosphere, and noosphere? Because that's new for me.
Yes.
Okay.
I don't
know how I missed that the first time I read the book, but that was news to me.
Yeah, there's sort of a moment where he's like, I'm just going to sidestep a lot of the issues raised by panpsychism and just say this and we'll move on. But that is, broadly speaking, seems to be the paradigm he's working in.
Okay.
Someone pointed out the fact that, that Wilber's likes to use the word simply a lot. That's sort of simply this. Another thing I've noticed him say a lot is, we'll get back to that later. And I don't know if he always does get back to that later. He says that a lot. And I'm like, okay, well, we'll see about that. Anyway, I think that was one of those instances.
So this is actually something that came up recently in a post that both you, Brendan, and also Christina, you guys both posted to Facebook links to the same article. by Christoph Koch, where he's talking about consciousness being universal, panpsychism. And so that is, it's all interrelated. In fact, how consciousness comes about and the different levels of consciousness is related to what I wanted to talk about here, so we can kind of frame that. Now, we can approach this very complex issue from multiple angles, but let me see if I can just share my screen here to present on this. And this is just one way of framing it. There's a lot of other ways, but this is drawing from, you know, not only what Wilber has, but also what Greg Enriquez has offered. And so, do you guys see this here? You guys can see the screen?
Yeah, it's great.
So I don't know how much of it is it showing all the columns, including the four.
Goes up to F, A to F.
Okay, so that's good. Okay, so you can see what it's all about here. What I'm trying to do with the light blue, this is what Greg Henriquez currently has in his so-called periodic table of behavior, because he's identifying behavior in a very, very general way, because he needed to understand, in order to do psychotherapy, as he was trying to figure out, you know, it's a bit of a mess, and he was having a difficult time some decades ago understanding how to do behavior, because he needed to understand what psychology was in general, which is it the theory of the mind? Is it a theory of behavior? And if it's a theory of behavior, well, all kinds of things behave. Behavior can be generalized to include, you know, matter. So what is behavior? So he created not only the tree of knowledge, which I suppose I could switch screens to that as well, but a lot of you guys have seen it. Perhaps I'll just put here, because I can only show one thing at a time. What I could do is I could put into the chat here the tree of knowledge system. You guys have probably.
Was your guy influenced by Wilber or the other way around, or did they not know about each other?
I'm pretty sure Greg Henriquez created this tree of knowledge.
Wow.
He did this 2 years after SES came out. So I don't know if he's said that it was inspired by that, but I'm just trying to find where's the chat here. So there's a lot of places to get, a lot of places on the internet to see Greg Enriquez's tree of knowledge system. But you can see he has a graphic showing these planes of existence stacked on top of each other as cones, which I think was partially inspired by Psychology, Spirituality, and other books that contributed to that. So I don't think that he mentioned the full history of how he came about it, except that he said it came to him kind of in a vision when he was kind of stoned. He admits that he didn't know what it meant initially. And then he was able to work out, he was able to reflect on it and realize what it ultimately means. And then more recently, he came up with this periodic table of behavior, which is again shown in this as this spreadsheet. I replicated it into the spreadsheet so that I could add more onto it. So the light blue is what he currently has in that. And there's, again, places on the internet where you can see he has that. Now, the dark blue here, or the slightly darker shade of blue, are things that I added that he didn't have in his, I've never seen this in one matrix that he put together, but this is all his stuff. The two different shades of blue are what Greg has put together in different places. I just have them all together. Okay. And then in the white, the unshaded cells are where I'm adding some additional information that I found in other places. So that the idea is to bring it all together from what Greg has from other places. You know, some of this is obviously from Teilhard de Chardin and Wilber and other sources. So you can see here in the white, the first row is the sphere name. Okay, so we have physiosphere, biosphere, we have noosphere. Okay, so and in the middle between biosphere and noosphere, we have zoosphere. And this is where, you know, there is a dispute, I guess, in some, even today, because some people, including, there was a debate between Greg Enriquez and Steve McIntosh about this here. So what's relevant to this discussion is this is how we frame this. This is how we frame our analysis of the different planes of existence and the related ontologies, so that we can do this analysis of, you know, is one application is the different levels of consciousness. One application is information energy. And I'm going to argue it makes sense to do this. I know that Wilber doesn't do this. When he talks of the biosphere, I'm now interpreting that to be essentially a conflation of the biosphere and noosphere. I'm sorry, the biosphere and the zoosphere. So the zoosphere, that comes from the Greek word for animal. And that is, it comes from, the reason that you have that is because animals have to have a model, an information model in their mind of their environment. Whereas inanimate life doesn't need to do that. So that is why there's that distinction. And if we go down to these additional rows that I added in here, and I'm not entirely sure this is 100% correct, but this is me. I'm trying to research and put together this matrix here. You can see that there's different ways in which information is stored. And there's different ways in which information energy evolves. It leads to different kinds of evolution. You can see here, for example, in this type of evolution, I guess you can consider physiochemical evolution a type of evolution. I'm not going to get too much. I'm not going to get into it right now. It's still a little unclear to me. But there was a book I read last year called, I don't know, it was by Stephen Johnson. I think it's like Where Ideas Come From or something like that, where he's talking about that as the most basic form of evolution. And that, like, for example, you have carbon with, because it has the ability to have bonds on all four sides, that leads to more possibilities, a greater possibility space. So you use this notion of the adjacent possible, and that you can understand that leads to essentially an evolution of macromolecules. So, and then once you have macromolecules, eventually life comes about. It's just, you know, replicate life that has its own ability to replicate, and then the Darwinian natural selection dynamics come into play, where you have bacteria and multicellular life forms and photosynthesis and you know, plant life. Now those all compete for energy resources, etc. When it gets to the point though where an organism can have a model of its environment and it can move, it needs to have that model of the environment, and that's essentially energy in its mind. I'm sorry, information in its mind of where it is, and it has the ability to then have its own ends. That becomes, that is a different way in which energy is stored, information is stored, but it is also brings about a different dynamic. So you can see here it's Darwinian and Lamarckian, involving the co-evolution of species and innate mental capabilities, where there are special evolutionary pressures for offspring to innately know that which the earlier generations had to figure out in order to survive. In order to exploit ecosystems, later generations needed to just know certain things, which gradually creates more complex mental capabilities. If you go to page 357 in SES, you will see that that Wilber is admitting this. And in fact, he says at the top of the page, if you have the same printing that I have, in a parenthetical statement or less Lamarckian, those who are born with the guiding imprint, which helps a person orient toward typical situations, would be more likely to survive and reproduce and pass the image along. So that transcends and includes Darwinian evolution. It's not the same exact thing as Darwinian evolution. Just for example, like if something is coming at your face, you flinch. And why do you flinch? Because you have a memory of someone getting hit like millions of years ago, and then remembering to flinch so that they don't get hit again. It's a memory that you have innately, and it didn't happen. It wouldn't have happened unless someone got hit in the first place. And there's all kinds of stuff like that. Like you have a fear of heights because someone was at a cliff, and they didn't have a fear of heights and they fell, and then they developed a fear of heights, and then their offspring had to innately have that fear of heights, even though they hadn't fallen. So I'm not exactly sure the mechanism through which that works. I mean, is it kind of Lamarckian, or is it kind of, maybe different than what Lamarck was talking about? It's a little bit like that. It kind of involves epigenetics as well, but we can just say there is a lot of scientific evidence that this is memories of one generation can somehow get passed into later generations. And that is the dynamic through which the mind gets more and more complex. So that's why we have this as a distinct plane of existence. And it is only out of that, only once we have a mind sufficiently complex, capable of conceptualizing its environment, that we can have culture, the last plane of existence here, emerging. So it has its own way of storing energy. Its own way of storing information and its own evolutionary dynamics, which, that's a whole separate conversation. There are sociocultural evolutionary attractors that, complex organisms that can, essentially people, right? We can conceptualize our environment. We can say, okay, I need to survive. I need to think about how I'm going to compete with other humans or cooperate with other humans. And then this also adds the ability, it gets to the point where humans have the ability to store information outside of our minds. We can write it down. We can create computers that have their own information processing. And then eventually that gets to the point where maybe there's going to be a fifth plane of existence, the so-called fifth join point that Greg Enriquez and others such as Jordan Hall talk about, but that is well beyond the scope of this presentation. I just wanted to show this to you guys. There's quite a bit going on here. Again,
cool. Would you post this to the group?
Yeah,
that'd be awesome.
This is something I haven't exactly posted anywhere yet. I was just working on this. A lot of times I put stuff like this together to help myself understand. I'm trying to understand what it is that I'm reading across these different sources. I'm trying to sort it out. And sometimes it's something that nobody has ever put together quite yet. It could also be that someone has put something like this together and their version is more accurate and more complete than mine. So I'm really coming from, I'm just an armchair sociologist here. I'm sort of a philosopher, although I like thinking of myself as a sociologist whose science hasn't been fully developed yet. That's how I like thinking of myself. So I'm only putting a lot of this stuff together because it is necessary for the kind of work that I'm trying to do. So I'll post it out there. People can comment on it, tell me if it's inaccurate or incomplete or whatever.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That's super cool. And these sorts of presentations and both in the sense of a literal presentation that you just gave, but also the presentation of information is is something that I gain a lot from. So I appreciate that very much. I just had a few thoughts that sorry if you hear the rooster in the background. I have a few thoughts related to some of the things you were just raising. So mainly around Lamarckism or Lamarckian evolution. I would say, so there's a really interesting kind of take on this that Joseph Campbell gives. He has his kind of big magnum opus is his 4-volume Masks of God series. If anyone's ever read any of that, it's very good. And the first volume, within the first couple of chapters, he talks about what he calls elementary ideas, which is a translation of the German word, because he's drawing on I forget the name of the person, but it was a deep influence of Jung as well. So like the idea of archetypes, basically. And he he's not this is pre-epigenetics, and it's he also just didn't really have a deep understanding of evolutionary processes, so he doesn't get into the details, but he basically does make the case that there are these sorts of things called elementary ideas that we are innately kind of provided with. And he uses an example of there's a kind of chicken that basically right when it hatches, they've found that basically it has a certain predator, which is a kind of hawk. And if that hawk goes by, these little chicks will just like run away in terror. But they'll only do that for their predator hawk. Like if a seagull flies by or something, they won't do it. So it's not just the stimuli, it's specifically this kind of predator. And there's no kind of experiential basis for that, because it's just they're newborns. And so this sort of stuff he kind of by analogy relates to these elementary ideas, which then of course Jung would be deeply influenced by and talk about as the archetypes of the collective unconscious and things like that. And so there is some good empirical evidence for something like that, even though the mechanics aren't entirely understood. But at the same time, I feel like bringing in Lamarck is maybe an unnecessary step, because and maybe there's going to be some revisionist way of bringing Lamarckianism back into the conversation because, well, how do I put this? So I mean, he was sort of like, he was pre-Darwin, and he was sort of not demonized, but kind of discredited before Darwin proposed his theory, and there was sort of that whole natural selection model. Because Lamarckianism in its crudest form is just like, if you cut the arm off of an organism enough, then it'll start to have babies with no arms, right? which is like not true, and we know that now because of genetics, which even Darwin didn't have access to. So at the same time, though, and you mentioned it briefly, there's that epigenetic stuff where genes do turn on or off in relation to our environment. So there's the relationship of environment to genetic information in complex ways, which again, we don't fully understand. But I guess I'm just saying that the Lamarck, I don't know if you have to bring in Lamarck to get at that basic idea, and maybe something more like elementary ideas and a certain other lineage would be kind of a I don't know, more fruitful and less kind of charged way of presenting the idea. But that was one of my only thoughts that came up as sort of asterisk point to that. But it's very cool.
Okay.
Brandon, I think this is wonderful, and I'm delighted you've done this. As somebody who came up through education, what I'm seeing on your map here is a question of, where does learning start? Like, as we move into mind and into culture, like at what point does the capacity to actually learn, which influences our survival, where does that come online? And there is thinking around that. And in my therapeutic background and my education background, because I do both, I teach that, blah, blah, there's two strands of thought. So one of them, obviously, is the pain-pleasure principle. So any little organism that has a nervous system developed enough to feel pain or pleasure, so that kind of comes on at biology. Even plants are suspected of being able to learn now because they apparently have prototype forms of response, pain and pleasure response. Like if you play music to a plant, it flourishes. Is that learning? Maybe not. But at some point, this is where it gets interesting and where trauma theory is starting to have massive inroads. That pain pleasure principle, where does it become learning rather than just response? At some point, that pleasure pain gets very intense. And we now call that trauma because there's learning in the intensity. The brain never forgets that intensity. And there's, Wilber calls it that moment where learning happens or emergence happens. There's a forking in the break, symmetry break, he calls it. Wilber calls it the symmetry break. That at some point, what fires together, wires together, is the saying in therapy. So there's repetition as well. So learning starts to happen with pain, pleasure at some point, and also with repetition. And as Brendan was saying, eventually that enters the epigenetic stream. At some point, if something is repeated often enough, it actually enters the genetic code, which is just a miracle. And they've done, for example, third generation Holocaust survivors. They now have this on the telomeres at the end of the genes. There was a Holocaust survivor, they had children, and those children, the third generation, had the same changes in the epigenetic code that the grandparents had. And they have found it on the telomeres. And this is incredible. In 3 generations, we can have learnt something through the intensity of the pain pleasure 3 generations earlier. So this fascinates me as a teacher and as a therapist. Like, how do we start learning behaviors for the well-being or evolution? Sadly enough, it looks like the pain pleasure principle that gets turned up. That's absolutely amazing. So at what point on this evolutionary stream can we start feeling pain pleasure? It's pretty early, I believe. But it only becomes learning a bit later. And I don't know if you saw that clip I put into the Metamodern spiritual container of Satguru saying everything is just memory and repetition. It's definitely worth listening to because he frames Wilber in quite a different way from the Hindu tradition of how do things come into manifestation. He thinks it's literally memory all the way up and all the way down. Wilber's never talked about that, memory. So if there's memory, there's a capacity to learn. It's brilliant. Like, your nose is on your face, not through anything you did, but through memory from your grandparents and all that information coming together and remembering how to create that shape. And so Satguru takes that all the way up and all the way down, that memory is the fundamental cause of causation. Even karma, when we come into our next life, we carry some memory with us in our stream of consciousness. Like, wow. Anyway, I'm just throwing that in because I'm excited about what we learn. That's really what I'm interested in terms of how we evolve. Without learning, there's no evolution. And without memory, there's no learning. So sorry, Dan, took up some space, but I think this is brilliant and I think we should carry on playing with it. It's really lovely.
Cole, you also had a question you asked in the chat here, and if you'd like, you can ask that here and offer your own thoughts. If you can ask your question, and then if you have your own answer, you can offer that as well.
So, oh yes, great. So there's a question here about memory and instinct. Exactly right. Beautiful question. So yes, instinct is a response of a very early form of memory about how to survive. It's a very archaic form of memory. So an organism that lives under a rock will have an instinctual memory about light. It doesn't want light. So as evolution occurs, that gets more and more sophisticated until we enter culture later on as book learning. Wow, we can start learning from words and symbols rather than just pain and pleasure. That's a great question. And the other one is the self contained in both zero and noospheres? That's for Brandon. There we go, Brandon, from Cole.
Oh yeah, so I wanted to know if Cole wanted to personally ask the question.
Hello, everybody. Grateful to be here always. Just seeing all of your faces on a weekly basis gives me a great sense of commonality, and I'm always humbled to be here. Yeah, it was. I think you might understand where I'm coming from, Brandon, because I had posted about some the maybe outdated, you'd said, parts of quantum dimensions. And, you know, there's an emphasis on like the fifth proposed dimension being related to self. And I was just reading it and I saw that, you know, the zoosphere is related to the mind, but then the noosphere kind of creates context for the self and perhaps the commonality as well with every other living creature. And I was just wondering, is you know, in your definition, is the self more in one or the other, or is it contained in both, or is it something maybe not described yet? Thank you.
So I wasn't sure. Did you say Brandon, B-R-A, or Brandon, B-R-E, or both of us maybe? Who specifically were you asking?
Well, Brendan is more for you, Brandon.
Norgard or Brendan Graham Dempsey, or both of us?
You, Norgard.
Okay.
I'm sorry for Brandon and Brendan.
Yeah. All right. So where is the self? And this is a difficult question to answer because I think that we have multiple selves. Our self is a whole on, and within our unified consciousness, which we are in sometimes, we can recognize that self. We can also recognize a greater identity and interdependence and interconnection with our social groups and within the world and universe as a whole. But then, you know, within our own minds, there's multiple selves that have sometimes competing identities and competing interests. So I think that you start to first have a conception of a self at this mind plane. And there are, so this, just to clarify, the way that Greg Enriquez frames this, you have emerging from within an existing plane, you have a new plane, but its complexity initially is quite small. And that's why these are upside down cones, you know? So out of the biological life, you have emerging the first simple mind. So in the course of evolution, you can have a very complex biosphere already there, and in the simplest forms of life that have their own mind can actually be quite simple. And then eventually emerging from that, you have a mind that has its own self-consciousness and its own self-conceptualization. And that's the notion of the self. Although our notions of the self are, I think they have to be holonic if you want to have you know, a non-contradictory conception, or a, you know, what is a more workable conception of the self given what we know. And this, so Greg Enriquez and John Vervaeke and Chris Mastropietro did a 12-hour discussion on the nature of the self, spirit, and soul in their series, The Elusive Eye. And I think what I was trying to do just now for a couple minutes is kind of generally summarize that, but I recommend getting into that because they have a lot more that they did there.
Yeah, I would also throw in, Grant just mentioned this in the chat, but I'll just read it. He says, self would be still yet undifferentiated from environment or context at the zoosphere. To me, that differentiation of self from the environment is key to creating culture in the noosphere. And so, which is getting at the issue that Wilber's going to, I think, get into in a lot more depth in the next couple of chapters, which is that in order to have this kind of sense of self, there needs to be a differentiation process that occurs between that self and its environment. So he'll go through the whole progression from that initial kind of unitary experience, which is sort of that, period after the birth of a child, where it sort of identifies kind of completely with its environment, and then over time slowly begins to differentiate itself from that environment. And I feel like that's sort of where that self concept would need to come in. And I guess one of the questions would be, to what degree does that same phenomenon occur in animals as well as humans? And it was just an interesting way that the metamodern schema of bringing in the model of hierarchical complexity can be helpful, because that provides a way to gauge kind of complex thoughts that aren't limited to human beings, and being able to distinguish different levels of complexity thinking at, even in other primates and crows and other, non-human animals, and being able to gauge that using the same kind of metric, which is interesting. So, whether an animal has experienced the differentiation from the environment, I guess, is something hypothetically that could be assessed there. Yes, Ellie, you got a question?
Yeah, so just to expand that thought about what does Wilber think about the self and where does it come online, I would agree that he calls it the self-aware mind starts at E, as Brendan's got it on E, with the big bang of the noosphere, that suddenly we become aware of ourselves. That's a massive leap in consciousness. But just to add in here that there are teachers now who criticize Wilber for not having developed the theory of the self enough. Like, he did so much work, but then he never took that thought to completion. So let me just fill in somebody's thinking around taking Wilber's thought and developing the theory of the selves. And this is Mark Gaffney, and I know that he's taboo in many circles, but I listen to him a lot because what he's done is taken the theory of the self, using the part whole nature of the self. He says there's 5 selves, 5 parts to the self. This is fascinating. He says as soon as we become self-aware, our self itself becomes starting to differentiate, because divergence and merger are the function of the universe. So at some point, this new holon of the self-aware mind starts to diverge again. And he's tracked the true self. Okay, let me start at the beginning. The separate self, when we start being aware, like at red, of our separate self, we develop the separation. I'm an individual. You get that as a 2-year-old. So the separate self comes online. Later, we have options. We can develop a false self that can be a mask and a pretender and have lots of shadow. Or we can find the true self, which we all know is that meditative unity. So that's a skill we can develop, or we can fall into it accidentally, like skiing or gardening, or you can sit on the cushion and you find the true self, which you keep referring to, but you also have a unique self, which is your journey in life to become an individual. So like into your 20s. And then if you reach mature adulthood, you find the fifth component to yourself, which is the evolutionary unique self, which is the self that has figured out where it's separative, has found its unitive true self, has dealt with its false self shadow, has expanded into its unique gifts, and then gives them back. That's the final mature adult self that contributes to society. So just to add, there's more theory since Wilber. Wilber was the beginning. He did this amazing job. Other teachers took one or two threads and developed that. So now there is theory about what is the self as a part holon, which is worth, if you're interested in that journey, reading. It's called the theory of the unique self.
Cool. Very interesting.
Yeah.
If anyone wants to piggyback off of any of that, by all means, go for it. Otherwise, I have a thought of dipping back into the text. If anyone wants to bring out any other ideas that are coming from chapter, where are we at? Chapter 4. And I could throw out a few things that spoke to me. But if no one's, oh yeah, Grant has got his hand raised. I think Brandon's got Brandon, you've got the moderator skills now. So I can't like lower people's
Yeah,
hands
just
or
a moment.
anything.
Let me make you co-host, Brendan.
Oh, okay.
I don't remember what page number it was on, but somehow I missed it. That Wilber is talking about how holons building upon each other on the interiors are without size of any kind. And he calls study of physical spaces sort of toxic or whatever. I had never considered that before. And I realized it's kind of infected the way that I think about my own interiors, thinking that something that I used to think and has been built upon is something that was somehow smaller. But I'm still trying to get my head around that. Anybody have any thoughts on that?
Wait, could you say a little bit more about that?
Okay, so I don't know. Well, we're talking about spirituality here in a metamodern spirituality group. So, forms that we think about, God is, or spirit or the divine is a version of a thing, and then we grow out of that thing, and somehow I've considered what I used to believe about the spirit or God as somehow physically smaller. And I don't know, I can't really articulate it very well because I'm still trying to get my head around that. And yet somehow I have gotten to this bigger way of thinking or whatever, but it's not bigger, not physically bigger. And I had never considered that. So it just kind of, I don't know, got smoke coming out my ears reading this chapter, I'm just confused by it.
Gotcha. Yeah, well, I mean, anything, like any language that's talking about spatial extension is going to be metaphorical when you use it with regard to thoughts, right? And the mind. It's not like, I mean, he used that little Latinate play on like the right hand column is sort of extension, whereas the left hand column is intention, right? And it's spaceless. And so you can, and we have to use metaphorical analogies that relate the objective external world to our internal spheres, but they're always going to be just sort of poetic comparisons.
Okay.
In that sense, would be my reading anyway. I mean, there's, and of course, I mean, with any metaphor, there's a way that maps well. But like, it's the sort of thing I would say that like when you eat spicy food and you say, oh, that's hot, or that's or there are these things like these cognitive tests where they'll draw like a sharp really sharp jagged line, and then kind of like a more squiggly bulbous one, and then the last, which one is Zack and which one is Blorby, and people will kind of
Oh.
get intuitively which one is which, but like there's nothing in, so it's a metaphorical leap that we're kind of making when we map our internal world by means of exterior analogies, but that doesn't mean that they're not deeply helpful. And so I think that there is something very fundamentally true about getting more expansive in your thinking, right? But there's nothing going on in here that's doing that. Like it might be rewiring thoughts, and it might be, you know what I mean? Like it's that would be what I would say to why that is sort of it's bumping up against our sort of metaphorical norms, maybe, to challenge that way of thinking. But it's also important because in some ways, if we're thinking that our thoughts work the way that like spatial extension works, then it's sort of I don't know. Maybe I'm overreading what you're.
No, not at all. I mean, I think that you're kind of hitting on it, because I'm not an expert in linguistics, but thinking about a signifier and a signified, it's almost like the signifiers we're using as metaphors we're choosing language that represents space, and that's, I guess, what we're getting at. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay.
Right. And I mean, and he starts to talk about this here. I mean, this could be a good segue into
Sure.
he begins to get at so on my copy 124, he starts to bring in Jean Gebser and the different kind of epochs and the different structures of human thought, and he'll get into this in a lot more depth in the next couple of chapters. But like that progression from, say, archaic to magic animistic to mythic to rational, like those are it's meaningful to speak of them as structures of consciousness, and it's meaningful to speak of them as expanded senses of self and expanded understandings of reality, but only using expansion as a metaphor for what's happening kind of conceptually, I would say.
Interesting.
Yeah. This is where, for me, he's kind of starting to set up what I think is one of the most fascinating elements of the whole framework, which is, I'll share a couple of quotes. I thought I'd highlighted for easy finding. But basically, the idea that that with this interior view that comes online, which in Norgard's sort of matrix would be, I guess beginning with the Zoosphere and then moving into the Noosphere, that there are structures of consciousness that are helping to, or participatory in framing the world that they are experiencing. So for example, on page 119, he says, each new growth in consciousness is not just the discovery of more of a pre-given world, but the co-creation of new worlds themselves, which is very important, I think. So it's the idea, and this is sort of a deeply kind of Kantian idea that, in this sort of former Cartesian dualistic way of thinking, there was this objective world and I was a subject, and I just represented the world internally. And so basically I'm just sort of this passive agent that's sort of taking the world in and mapping it, and there it is. And all that's really tidy and neat and nice. And what Kant was sort of the first to talk about and discuss in a really deep philosophical way was that there's a whole area in which our human minds are participating in the construction of that reality that we're experiencing. So it's not as simple as I'm mapping some objective reality in my head. It's that my head also has categories of thought that are taking in stimuli and sort of filtering it through my pre-given categories to help create the world that I'm experiencing. And so what this is getting at, and he doesn't talk about Kant in this context, but it's, you know, it's important because it's relevant. But what he's talking about is that as consciousness itself takes different shapes through evolution, the world itself gets created differently by different people, right? So if you're operating, and he'll use Gebser and other people to kind of name specifically what these distinct interior structures of consciousness are, like archaic or magical or mythical. But his point is that each structure of consciousness is uniquely co-creating that reality in a unique way. There's another quote on page 125. He says, each of these structures of consciousness generated a different sense of, and then he gives this whole list: space-time, law and morality, cognitive styles, self-identity, mode of technology, drives or motivation, types of personal pathology, types of social oppression, go on and on and on. And what to me there is so fascinating is that, you know, to really grapple with that is, I think, a very profound notion that as consciousness itself is evolving, it's taking on new structures, which are then partially generating the new interior realities that people are experiencing. So that when you take this kind of to its fuller implications, you know, if you talk to someone, let's say a rationalist is speaking to someone, you know, operating with a kind of animistic or a magical sensibility or structure of consciousness. Those aren't just people who are sort of seeing the world differently. Like there's some kind of given world, and the rationalist has sort of that take and they've got this take. It's that there's this sort of fundamental, in some ways, distinction of realities that are coming into interaction there, that those structures of consciousness are themselves shaping. And I think that this is helpful for formulating it that way in a lot of different ways. But one of the reasons why is that it can be very confusing sometimes to interact with, depending on anywhere that you're at along this spectrum of consciousness. If you're interacting with folks and they seem to interpret the world deeply in a totally different way than you do, it might be easy to just write them off as like, well, that's wrong, or that's, you know, I just don't get why they can't see the way I see. But when you really appreciate the deep implications that they are genuinely operating in almost a different world than you are, I think that those disconnects start to make a lot more sense, which isn't to overemphasize the boundaries. I mean, these things are permeable, right? But I think it's a very profound idea, which is one of the things that I find infinitely, you know, able to probe and explore. So anyway, Sally, you've had your hand up for a while.
Yeah, no, beautiful, Brendan, because this excites me too. So I would reframe it like this, and it takes the question of where does learning come on board to the next level, which is at what point do we become co-creators with spirit? Like that is such a spectacular idea. So we have to have certain capacities to start co-creating. You know, things like ants and bees have already started. They, for example, they are capable of architecture. Like, wow, they are beginning to co-create their environments and shape their social fabric through the structures they build. So it's earlier than people, but people who then become self-aware and start to have creative cultural capacities take it exponentially. And I just want to quote out of the book on page 117. Wilber tracks this capacity. He says we move, first of all, from sensations. So that's the prototype pain, pleasure, learning we spoke about earlier. We move from sensations to perceptions. So some animals have perceptions and can respond appropriately, and so it's moved out of the nervous system into the organelles and the eyes and the ears. Then we start getting impulses, like that comes on board, as we said, at red. Like we start acting out of our impulses, and they're still fairly subconscious. Then we start getting emotions. That's real complexity. Do animals have emotions? Yep, dogs definitely do. Animals have emotions, some of them, no doubt. Maybe reptiles don't. Who knows? They seem cold to us. We don't know. They certainly have impulses. Then humans, and maybe animals, because we see them dreaming, we get, Wilber says, images. That's amazing. So as soon as we start having the capacity to have images, we can start imagining. Then we become very creative. We start to co-create culture, and then we create objects through, he says the last one is symbols. As soon as we learn symbols, we start speaking to each other through symbolic sounds and language. We start making art and being able to communicate through visual symbols. Math, numbers is just symbols. Like, so he goes sensations, perceptions, impulses, emotions, images, symbols. That right there is the capacity to learn and transmit and co-create culture. Wow, I was blown away by that. And then he distinguishes the difference. Images are not symbols. Symbols are not concepts. So he takes it beyond symbols to concepts. Just, wow.
But also, I mean, that different symbol stages can be created as well, and that can operate in different spheres, right? So like the distinction between like a mythic literal symbol stage and a, you know, rationalist symbol stage are qualitatively, you know, profoundly different. And to appreciate that the world inhabited that's created by those different symbol stages is very different, I think is really important. Which for me, maybe to bring this back to the way you introduced the question, is sort of about co-creating or participating with spirit. Well, spirit will be understood differently according to what symbol stage you're operating in. And that's the most profound thing for me about all this, is, and well, before maybe I or this relates also to what Grant was talking about asking about the self, right? Because the self also is another thing that is going to be operating in a different way depending on what, you know, what symbol stage you're operating in, and to what degree of the complexity of these things. That you're, you know, there is a religious studies professor named Bill Payton who wrote a book called Religious Worlds, and he really thinks about religions as being these worlds that people create, these sort of bubbles that are kind of generated, that are sort of, you know, they have a kind of an internal consistency, and of course if you get outside of that and either you look back or you look somewhere else, you know, that creates a whole bunch of complications for any kind of religious world. But the idea that we are world building all the time by means of these symbols, and by means of everything else that Sally just mentioned, all the images and all of our emotions and everything, that these are constitutive of the worlds that we're building, and that we may be operating in a world that's different from other people, and how that is informing how the way we think, how they think, how people think is can be kind of revelatory. And then with that map, or with that framework, which is in many ways is what Wilber is kind of providing, is sort of wow, okay, well, how can we make use of this understanding, this greater framework, which kind of reflexively means that there's also a point at which we live, you can create or inhabit a world which is aware of worlds, which is sort of that whole second tier concept, as I understand it, which is where this thing kind of becomes self-aware, which is where, again, to Sally's point about the co-creation and the participatory element, it's sort of like once you're aware that this is a phenomenon that's going on, then the degree of participating and the degree of engagement with it takes on a whole other and richer and deeper and vaster quality. But yeah, Grant, what did you want to say?
You know, I've got just tons and tons of questions I've been jotting down, but I'm trying to get at exactly what we're talking about. There's some substance that we're trying to get at. I don't know what it is really, other than worlds. And I think was it Heschel that said words create worlds. I think that's exactly what we're talking about here. But you said this stuff like becoming aware of other worlds is sort of second tier. And I wanted to push back just a little bit, thinking about like pluralism came online at, I think, Orange we talked about, and to me, pluralism is like recognition of another way of thinking and tolerating it. And then the move to green would be not just pluralism, but relativism, acknowledging worlds and their validity as true for somebody else. And we affirm that. And then the part that I just can't get my head around yet is that second tier of like, how does it all fit together in some sort of, and even more complicated, are all worlds that are created real? And if we co-create them, they must be, even if they're morally inept. And I think that maybe Wilber talks about that later in terms of pathology and like how things get traumatized, and pieces of us get messed up and get stumbled down the ladder and all that. But I guess I just don't know. I mean, so one of the notes I jotted down was, what are we co-creating? Is it just these worlds that we're conceptualizing, or is there something material to it? And we talk about ants building structures. Okay, that's yes. And what is the sort of parallel on the left side of the quadrants to those structures? There's some like architecture, and I wish Sarah was here to talk about architecture. Because if there's some cognitive function that's designing structures and creating worlds in the physical world, then there must be some parallel on the left side if Wilber's ontology is correct. And I guess that's kind of what I'm struggling to get at. And I hear that word thrown around quite a bit, is structure. Like, we're building structures, and like, okay, I can see a physical structure in my mind. I don't know what a structure in the noosphere looks like, or feels like, or sounds like, or I'm using all these words I don't even know make sense. That's a whole mess of stuff to talk about, but it's just this stuff keeps popping up for me.
Well, can I have a go at that? And then I'd like to hear other people's views, because I think it is really, really important. And here's how I get it. I would sort of slightly reformulate the way that you expressed the orange and the green thing with the spiral dynamic stuff, because as I would think about it, is that the orange is the rationalist perspective that comes online, that sort of is able to see universals. It's no longer bound by, oh, this is the way that my group does it, and therefore it's true. It's able to kind of say, oh, wait a second, all these groups do different things, but what do we all do? And kind of look for some great overarching, universal truth. And however, it's still dogmatic in the sense that it's dogmatic about its universal truth. So like when you think about the hardcore, reductionists or the materialists and the new atheists and folks, there's sort of this sense of, no, it's really important that no one does religion because we think that's wrong. Okay. So there's a dogmatism there. It's just sort of like, ironically, kind of a dogmatism that's anti-dogmatism. But it's like, this is the way to do it, and it should be for everyone because it's universal. And if you're doing this thing, it's aware of limited parochialism, and it's saying that's bad. So in being aware of the parochialism, it is still kind of operating with a greater vantage, but it's still also then coming down to this dogmatic, this is the way it needs to be sort of perspective. Then there's sort of the green shift, which is, well, wait a second, universalists, you're saying all these things about things are being universal, but you haven't considered how contextual they all are and how related they all are to, this world building thing that we're talking about. And it's able to kind of see above the universalist pitch, but it gets lost in that kind of relativism that you're talking about, which is, well, what is it? If we're all building different structures, then maybe there isn't really anything that's actually real. We're just building different structures. And so your structure is as good as my structure. And so what, it's all just social construction, right? And that's about where kind of green leaves off. I think what you're gesturing towards and trying to wrap your head around, the way I wrap my head around it, is that what gets above a higher vantage on that is saying, well, wait a second, that doesn't work out. What you can do then when you realize that we're all building these structures is you can start to organize them and relate them to each other, which is what, this book is sort of doing, right? It's sort of, and others like it, is sort of, we build structures, but how do they relate to each other? What's the bigger ontological framework in which they all fall into place? So it's no longer just saying, well, you have an animistic, perspective and I have a rationalist perspective, but they're all equal or whatever. Because and this is a big point that Wilber continually makes over and over again, is that there's this performative contradiction of this sort of relativist postmodern stance, because it's saying this is the right way to think about it. And if you don't all agree with me, then you're wrong. So it's still being absolutist, but it's being ironically kind of absolutist about radical relativism, which again is this contradiction that then breaks down. So the higher order kind of integration of all these things is to be able to set these perspectives, these worlds in order, and be able to frame them in relation to each other, and be able to say, oh, animism leads to this sort of mythic perspective, which leads to this rational perspective, which leads to this pluralist perspective, which leads to this systemic perspective, which is the system of perspectives itself. And that is the point at which, if you're in green and you hear people talking about that, you're going to get really mad, because then it seems, and this is all these debates that are going on right now around stage theories in general, and all this stuff is operating at that, I think, juncture between this green to this yellow, or however you want to put it, the relativist to the systematic. For various reasons, these things, create tensions. So that's how I would put it. And I don't know if that makes any sense or helps explain. And I'm curious how other people would put it, like Sally.
So this is really a good question. Grant, you asked, what are we doing here? Are we creating something? Like, what is the big project that we're all engaged in? And where I sometimes think Wilber was a bit anthropocentric, actually, is when he thinks that other species are not world building. Like, okay, so I have a theory, like bees and ants are world building. And what is interesting is they are more social than individual. So Wilber says we become individually developed, and as we become world-centric, we become more social, right? We start relating to others at deeper. And social insects don't have a self, we think, but they are much more social than we are. They cooperate. And I've been thinking about this, for example, even their senses. Like, I saw this meme the other day. Bees dance shapes. Snakes see heat. They taste smell. Bats hear shapes. Elephants communicate below our wavelength with each other all the time. So there's whole ranges of activity that we are literally cut out of because of our limited sensation capacity. So we've built this whole theory about why we're here from quite a limited range of ability to perceive what's going on the world building project. So animals might not have a developed self, but they're way more developed socially in some senses than we are. These murmurations of birds that can, so Wilber would say that's not as sophisticated as us. And I would perhaps sometimes question that sometimes is a bit anthropocentric as far as I'm concerned. And just because we don't have those ranges, we're building our own project here as if nothing else is building their project. That's me. Thanks.
Cole, did you want to say something?
I just thought that was beautifully put, Sally, first. And it sparked some ideas of thoughts that I've had recently in conversations that I've had about, are we supposed to, as these perceived higher conscious individuals, are we supposed to create structures that not dictate, but communicate to us these truths? Or are we supposed to, as selves, investigate and come to a collective truth that's similar? Part of the reason why I thought about that is when you were talking about like bees or mushrooms being another organism that is very collective, and in the way you describe it, world building, I think that's, yeah, a great connection. And I wonder, when we align ourselves with something that's maybe super ego, I don't know how to describe it, but something that's kind of the greater good, you know you know quite possibly we're doing a similar type of world building. But on top of that, we're talking about learning and these structures we're creating. And yeah, it just like I said, kind of sparked up again that kind of thread. Are these universal truths supposed to be found and integrated on a self level, or are we supposed to create structures that allow us to be subconscious, which kind of relates back to Brendan's conversation with Alexander Bard about how he wants, or he envisions, a Cynthios where a world is able to be subconscious, I think was the word he used, to like have fun or whatever, not really be conscious. And so I'm just kind of curious there, because I feel like there's kind of an interplay with a lot of these ideas. Anyways, I've got to go, so I'm gonna try to listen. Just so great to see all of you guys again. I really look forward to these, and for lack of a better term, I love you all. All right.
See ya.
Love you too, buddy.
Thanks, Cole.
I don't have anything that of great substance to be able to answer that. It was sort of a profundity maybe that I can't wrap my head around in terms of being able to provide any thought. I don't know if anyone else has anything that they want to.
Is that the word that he used, subconscious?
Well, maybe I understood. Well, he brought up Bard's conversation, and I understood maybe what he was talking about a bit different. And I don't necessarily want to bring in too much of that into our current context, but because I also have my own rather big differences between the Bard Cynthius vision and all that stuff. But yeah, I think I don't want to try to paraphrase what he was saying, but the distinctions between trying to create a world, it sounded like that's is either super egoic or and maybe because of that operating subconsciously.
I've always understood the concept of like Freud's superego as some sort of negative force that's causing you to feel guilt or shame about something you're not able to do, or it's like the force that's driving your behavior that's completely unconscious. And I wondered if that's what he meant by subconscious, was perhaps unconscious. But the superego, that word to me has such a negative connotation because of Freud. So I'm not sure where that was going.
Well, on the topic, at least, of having to depart soon, we're coming up against 5:30, and my battery is also dwindling. So maybe we want to throw in some final reflections and then go gently into the night. Anyone want to start?
I just love being able to talk about this shit.
Yeah.
It's great. Likewise.
I think that we could talk about his analysis of Freud, id, ego, superego, and he corrected, that the translation is often wrong. It's actually it versus I. And then it's again where, like, when we get to that point, we can bring in Henriquez, who has a reinterpretation or a way of evaluating that in terms of symbolic justification. Like we justify what is deep within our subconscious, and through our words, through our speech, and that is also where shadow can come in. So that's how we can understand a lot of this in terms of a unified psychology, and in terms of updated science offered recently by people such as Enriquez and Vervaeke.
Gotcha.
Yeah. No, take it away, Grant. You were going to say something.
I was just going to say I think way too much, and I'm nothing but questions right now. So I just am thankful that you guys let me ask questions. So thanks for having me.
Well, I think I speak for all of us, which I don't usually want to do, but we all appreciate your questions, so keep them coming. I just want to throw these things out here in the last couple of minutes because they're important and they get raised in this chapter. But so he hints at, and he'll develop this a lot further, as I've mentioned a couple times in the chapters to come, but he hints at these structures of consciousness. He brings up Jean Gebser, and we're going to get into all that, which again, for me is like, that's some of my favorite stuff in all of this. And so anyway, that comes up. He also introduces the 4 quadrants in this chapter, which is huge for integral theory in general. Just didn't want to pass over that. And we can maybe bring that up. I mean, in many ways, Brandon's presentation sort of gets at a lot of that, though the quadrant approach specifically is, I think, helpful for contextualizing all those sorts of evolutions and developments. He talks a bit about subtle reductionism, which is an important part, but I don't know, not really so crucial for what we're doing with here. And I guess those were, and then he also talks about the big 3, which is a theme that he'll return to a lot, which is sort of talking about the quadrants as it relates to the big 3, namely the good, the true, and the beautiful, which goes all the way back to Plato as being these philosophical fundamentals, which is I've found to be I don't know. It doesn't really land with me, I guess, in various ways, and maybe we could talk about that at some point. I feel like he's trying to bring in this kind of deep Platonic language, which doesn't necessarily have to be there. And in some ways, by trying to then be talking about quadrants, but also 3, he sort of, it brings in this kind of confusion. Why you can reduce both of the its to one thing, but you can't reduce I and we. I don't understand that.
I think that one of the more serious critiques that people have of integral is the pretty much the discarding of lower right almost entirely.
That's a good point. I hadn't thought about that, but that's true. And that, I think, is where a lot of that lower right stuff is kind of happening now with a vengeance right now.
Yes. Well, I'm sorry. I would like to do another presentation, also inspired by the work of Henriquez, that interprets the quadrants in terms of the top 2 layers, top 2 planes of existence. And the others are essentially like, that's how you come to understand the world, because you are directly embedded within those top 2 planes. And also that the there's just, I think, a natural way of seeing epistemology in terms of first, second, and third person. And then if you overlay that with the planes of existence, you end up getting the quadrants. And that's just my interpretation of why it essentially can be seen as a tripartite and also as a quadrants. I'll talk about if there's, or at some point in the future, if there's time.
Yeah, let's tee up another presentation then for next time. Or maybe, well, it depends. Yeah, either next time or we can play that bit or whatever seems to fit best. Well, we're at the more or less at the 5:30 mark. Any final remarks before we call it for the day? I really enjoy this as usual, and I echo Sally's sentiment. Always really great to be able to talk about these ideas. It's a kind of it's a unique container in which these sorts of concepts can come out and be elaborated on and explored. And I appreciate everyone here for being able to facilitate all that. So to co-create it, if you will. But anyway, well, until next time, again, Brandon, thanks for doing the links and stuff. And I guess this one will probably be up online before long because cool. So, all right. Well, until next time, everyone.
Have a good week.
Have a good week. Take care.
Bye.